Janet, welcome to our December book club. And we're going to talk tonight about white pine, the natural and human history of a foundation American tree. I selected this book to lead. It was at Sugarloaf. They were selling it at Sugarloaf, and I worked there this summer, and I was interested in reading it. And in the meanwhile, John Pastor, the author of the book, saw that we were having book club and has offered to participate. So I would like to introduce the author of our book, John Pastor.
Okay. We'll turn it over to you, and nice to have you here. I'm Hillary. I'm one of the master naturalists of the North Shore chapter. We're a new chapter, and just sign in as you come in and where you're from. And John, we're going to turn this over to you, and when you finish, we'll take questions and answers from people.
Okay, so I'd like to keep this somewhat informal and focus more on your questions. I think Kelsey and a few others sent around a few questions that I suggested would be good for discussion, kind of general ones. What was surprising, or what was in the book that was surprising to you? I enjoy hearing people tell me, oh, I didn't know that about white pine. And so anything like that. What might have been confusing that could lead to that you would like to ask me about for clarification? And I have to warn you, I'm retired now, but I was a professor at in biology department at the University of Minnesota Duluth, and I do have a tendency to give long lectures. So I'll try to keep my answers brief and to the point. And then one final thing, whenever I've given talks about this book, I always ask people during the course of the talk to think about a particular white pine or white pine stand that has some meaning to them. Either, in Minnesota, obviously the Boundary Waters is one place, but there are many beautiful white pine stands in the UP, the Sylvania Tract, and the Adirondacks, in Maine and Pennsylvania, throughout the range of white pine, or any particular white pine tree that for some reason has a particular meaning to you. And, we could share that with each other too. And those often make for really nice stories. So how did I come to write this book? Well, as a professor, my research for the last 40 years that I've lived in northern Minnesota has been largely on the North Woods, with some research up in the Arctic as well. But the North Woods, this forest of spruce and fir and white pine and red pine and jack pine, as well, mixed in with sugar maple and the two birches, yellow birch and paper birch, and red oak, northern red oak, as well as a bunch of other species, mountain ash and so forth, that stretches from Minnesota clear eastward on either side of the Great Lakes, all the way past Maine, actually into New Brunswick, and maybe a little bit of Newfoundland, the western edge of Newfoundland. And it's a remarkable biome. There's lots of very interesting research questions because each tree species does something different with the nutrients and water it requires. And so if there's a change in species for whatever reason, you can immediately pick it up at the ecosystem level. And so it's a very good ecosystem in order to study the links between species and their natural history and life cycles and whole ecosystem properties like productivity and nutrient cycling and so forth. And my research has been largely on that. And it also includes moose and beaver and what species they browse and how they're changing the composition of the forest. the effects of climate change on the Northwoods, and some work on peatlands that we have in the Northwoods as well, which have a similar kind of composition of species that do, each one is very unique and does something very different. And so a number of years ago, I had written a collection of essays called What Should a Clever Moose Eat? But it was a collection of essays on the species of the Northwoods and how they come together and form this kind of ecosystem biome. And it was published by Island Press, which is a nonprofit publisher, actually, that has a long history of publishing books on the environment and on natural history. And I really love working with the people at Island Press. They're just wonderful people. The editors are great, and they're just fun to work with. And one thing I learned was that in producing a book like this, it's not just you write a bunch of stuff and put a staple, you send them off to the publisher and they put a big staple through it and bind it and send it to the bookstores. It's much more involved than that. But at the end of when that book was published, and I think Drury Lane carries that book as well. My editor at Island Press said, "So what would you like to write for your next book?" And I gave her a couple of ideas, and one of them was about white pine. And she said, "Well, why didn't you put that in the What Should a Clever Moose Eat book?" And I said, because every time I thought about writing an essay about white pine, there was so much. And white pine is so important as a key species in the Northwoods that I realized that one essay wasn't going to do it. And it really needs a book. And so I'd like to start working with you on ideas on how that book could be organized. And originally, and so what I wanted to do was combine both the natural history and also some of the history of how we've interacted with white pine. But the primary focus originally was going to be on natural history of white pine and its life cycle. So I was going to start from the seedling stage and just follow it up through maturity into old growth. And even after the tree dies, the dead tree still plays a role in the forest. And so one of the scientific ideas that I've been, playing around with is that the life cycle of an organism doesn't end when the organism dies. It extends further into what happens with its carcass, because that for trees, that's still a great storehouse of carbon and nutrients, and it provides structure in the forest. It still provides habitat for a lot of species. Well, when I started thinking about it that way, that seemed a logical way to do it. But then if you think about it, it was hard to work the history of how we've interacted with white pine in with that. Because when we started interacting with white pine as European settlers, but even before that, with the Native Americans, they were interacting with white pines that were mature and old growth. So I would actually have to start if the life cycle, they weren't interacting with the seedlings at that point. And so the whole thing was sort of backwards. And so then I decided, well, I will just use the chronology of what we've discovered about white pine and why, and follow the chronology of how we've interacted with white pine and how through that we learned more and more about the natural history and the ecology and the biology of white pine, and how that changed how we saw white pine and interacted with it in the future. And that's basically the structure of the book. The narrative line is the history of how different cultures of the Northwoods have interacted with white pine. And as I was writing the book, it occurred to me very quickly that the different cultures that have interacted with white pine And I don't just mean Native American and white European. I also mean like the Paul Bunyan culture is a different culture of the Northwoods than the wilderness culture is, or the forest management culture is, and so forth and so on. And the culture that we're now entering of how climate change is going to affect how we think about our relationship with the land. So we're entering a new culture of how we interact with the world around us. And one of the key scientific ideas in the book, as you probably realize, is that white pine is what ecologists are coming to call a foundation species. And these are large plants that form the foundation of an ecosystem because because they're so large and relatively common, that they control the entry of energy into an ecosystem by sunlight and photosynthesis. They control the movement of water through the ecosystem by uptake from the roots and the evaporation of water from their crowns, from their leaves and needles high in the canopy. And they control the cycling of nutrients by uptake from the soil, then converting those nutrients into leaves and wood. And then when the leaves, including needles, fall to the ground, they all decompose differently. And so a foundation species really controls a lot of what's happening in the ecosystem, the flow of energy and material to an ecosystem. It also, because of the large sizes of the individuals, controls the structure of an ecosystem. It controls the habitat for many, many animals. And it occurred to me that we could expand that into a social context because these large foundation species really are the core of the cultures, how cultures interact with the landscape. So if you think of other plant species that might be foundation species, Douglas fir, for example, is a foundation species of the Pacific Northwest. It's an important part of the indigenous cultures and also the white European settlement cultures in the Pacific Northwest. Saguaro cactus would be a foundation species of the Sonoran Desert, both native and non-native cultures. And even in the prairie, big bluestem. If you read Willa Cather and people like that, it was written about the prairies. They talk about the big bluestem and the sea of grass and how, moving through the big bluestem as their covered wagons went northward. It was like the covered wagon was a ship, sailing on this sea of grass, much of which was big bluestem. So one of the things I thought about in writing this book is how did all these different cultures see white pine, and why did each succeeding culture see white pine differently than the preceding one? And it's not as if each succeeding culture, from Native Americans to the American Revolution to the white pine logging to Thoreau in the beginning of wilderness to Gifford Pinchot and scientific management of white pine, it's not that they replaced the particular culture. They sort of added on to it. And out of that comes the conflicts we have in how we interact with the landscape around us, and particularly these big trees. Do we harvest them? Do we eradicate them? Do we harvest them and use them to create beautiful woodwork, like, the bookshelves behind me, the desk I'm sitting at, the furniture and so forth? If you read the first page of my book, you know that my father was a carpenter and cabinet maker and just made beautiful furniture that we grew up with. Or do we preserve them as wilderness? And how do we manage them to provide not just timber, but also at the same time provide habitat and watershed protection and so forth? And so each of these cultures gets layered on top of or accreted on top of the other. and they're often contradictory. You know, pure wilderness is contradictory to timber management. And that was a big argument that Gifford Pinchot, the founder of the Forest Service, had with John Muir. They knew each other personally. They went camping together. But it was a big argument about what to do, particularly with big trees and forests composed of big trees. And when you have a lot of these resources, big trees or desert or prairie, the conflicts really don't matter. There's plenty for everybody. But it's when these things become less and less common, and even to the point of being rare, or the original prairie or white pine forest or Douglas fir forest or Sonoran desert, the patches of the original untouched stuff become smaller and smaller and more rare. Then these different cultures that are accreted on top of one another, then they start to conflict because of the different ways they see these foundation species. So that's basically a summary of the ideas in the book. Working with a publisher, particularly Island Press, it's interesting. So I met with my editor at the professional meeting that I go to, and there are often booksellers there. And so she said, well, what's going to be the structure of the book? And I explained to her. And then she said, all right, send me an outline and a brief synopsis and so forth. And I'll take it up with my fellow editors and we discuss it and send it back to you. And so working with Island Press is actually going back and forth a lot before the contract is signed, to try and refine the proposal and how the book is going to be structured and so forth, so that when I start writing the book, and particularly what they don't want to happen is if I start writing the book and I finish it and then I send it off to them, they say, well, wait a second, this is not what we expected. And then you run into a lot of problems. And so there was about a year of us going back and forth and refining things and saying, well, what about this? What about that? Are you going to include this? Are you not going to include this? How are you going to work this in? What if we move the chapters around a little bit, or what if we save that idea for a later chapter and so forth? And it was a really interesting intellectual discussion that went on for a whole year before finally they said, okay, a lot of details need to still be worked out, but they'll be worked out in the writing and editing. So we're satisfied we're on the same track. So, all right, here's the contract, start writing. So that's how it went. And some people might be really frustrated with that approach. They get gung-ho and I just want to start writing, and I'm so inspired and jazzed up. I really, really like that approach. In the end, the book ended up being quite a bit different in structure than what I had originally thought it should be or would be. And I think it's much better this way than what I originally did. If I just wrote the book that I was originally thinking of writing, I don't think it would have been as good a book as this. So I'm very proud of this book. I think that's kind of all I have to say for introduction about what I think the book is about and how it came to be, and what it's like to work with a publisher. Not all publishers work this way. Some publishers, I had written a previous more technical book on ecology, and that publisher was just, all right, here's the contract, go ahead and write it. And it turns out in the end, we didn't argue or anything. That what I gave them is they were very happy with, and the book is still in print. But it was much less satisfying just to go away and then, okay, you got 2 years to write this book. And then in 2 years, I send it to them. They say, okay, we'll send it to a copy editor and, they'll correct the grammar here and there. And okay, fine, it's done. And it just wasn't as even though I'm very proud of that book, and the book has gotten a lot of good reviews in the scientific literature, the process of working with that publisher, who's a very well-known publisher, was not as satisfying as working with the people at Island Press. So I would encourage you, if you enjoyed this book, to go to the Island Press website, if you're not familiar with Island Press, and see what other books that they've published. They are now getting into other things like the urban environment and what they call the built environment, which is the buildings that we build and the environment that those buildings create and what that environment does to us. But they've still kept their original line of books on natural history. That's still the core of natural history and ecology of what they publish. But they've added these other lines and expanded, and they are just an incredible publisher. Very, very high quality literary books. So I think it's just, if you just Google Island Press, it'll come up, and spin through their catalog and stuff. The books are in paperback. They don't publish in hardcover because it's too expensive, and the prices run about $30 a piece. So the price for my book is about average, I would say. And it's about the length of most books that they publish, a few hundred pages.
Okay, are we ready for some questions then, John? Are you ready for hearing some thoughts from people who read the book and have some questions or things that spoke to them?
Absolutely. Let's
Okay.
start the discussion.
As you're thinking, I have one that's prepared so we can toss it out there. Somebody that's not able to attend tonight asked the question, how he thinks White Pines will fare, specifically in Cook County, with climate change.
It's a good question. We don't know. We can speculate. I don't think white pine is going to go extinct, but its range might shrink back from the west. I don't think Bemidji is going to have white pine if climate warming continues as it's warming. Bemidji is only about 30 or 50 miles from the prairie. I don't think white pine is going to survive there unless we slow down climate change. I think in Cook County, it's cold enough that a little bit of warming might make white pine actually grow better. It's almost a little too cold in Cook County for the best growth of white pine.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think white pine will always be around in Cook County and other places. But what's going to happen is the range of white pine might shrink from the south and from the west and move more northeast more into Canada and northern Maine. Northern Maine is more spruce fir area and so forth. Maybe it'll even get over into Newfoundland. Well, what is going to happen is that other species that white pine is associated with are also going to migrate, and they're going to migrate at their own rate and in their own directions, because they all have different tolerances to temperature and moisture and so forth. And so white pine is going to become, in many places, associated with different species than it is now. Maybe in some places the same. White pine, sugar maple. Sugar maple will probably be more of a important component in Cook County than it is now. Northern red oak, maybe. So you might have a white pine forest that you see now in northern Wisconsin, like around Wausau, someplace like that, where it's more associated with more hardwoods and less with spruce and fir. I think spruce and fir are going to move pretty much out of the state completely, almost completely. You might have some spruce and fir remaining right along Lake Superior, like right up to the ridge top, and that's it. So I think it's going to become associated with other species, and what those species are will be different in different places. They'll be different here in Pennsylvania, in New York, Maine, so forth, the UP. And that means that white pine is going to play somewhat different roles in the ecosystem in which it's founded, because these other species also play their own role. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how the forest reassembles itself and reorganizes itself as species start migrating in response to climate change. If under really extreme climate change scenarios, the prairie actually could come east almost to Lake Superior. I don't think that's going to happen, but I can't say for sure it's not going to happen, but that would be a really extreme scenario, particularly for Cook County. I don't think the prairie is going to get to Cook County. It might get to southern St. Louis County, where I am now, but not to Cook County. So
Wonderful. I'm going to toss it over to Heather and
sweet
then
spot.
to Betsy next after Heather.
Yes, thank you. We really enjoyed the book. I loved the way you put this into a larger historical perspective. I mean, starting from the very beginning of white pine spreading after the last ice age, which I think this gives the book a really wide range, also thinking into the future. I mean, you can think in terms of the short-term future of after 100 years, or the much, much longer future. So I really enjoyed that. I had one technical question which confused me, which is this white pine rust that you talk about, that affects both some current plants and the white pines that was brought over from Germany. In Germany, there weren't any white pines. There must be something else that also takes that role that the white pine takes. I was wondering what that was and how that interacts with that particular white pine rust.
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to that. I tried to look through the literature to see, well, why weren't the German foresters concerned about this? And in Germany, you have more spruce and fir. And the pine in Europe is largely the Scots pine, Pinus sylvestris. In Estonia, it's called the Riga pine. And that pine, there are two main branches to the pine genus. One branch is the white pines, of which our eastern white pine is like the type species. And the other branch are the yellow pines or the hard pines. And red pine and jack pine, which the blister rust does not affect, are yellow pines. So the blister rust does not affect the yellow pines for reasons that I don't think anybody really knows. It just affects the white pines. But there aren't too many members of the white pine branch in Europe. So there's a few in Switzerland, when you get up into the alpine areas, and in Italy, there's a few members of the white pine. The blister rust may have been confined to a very small area in Europe, and there might have been enough white pine members of the white pine branch to keep it from going extinct, along with the currents that serve as the alternate host. But when it got to America, it was like, oh my God, this is paradise to me, because I got all these white pines all over the place, and they're planting them. They're making food for me, And so I think that I don't think in Europe the blister rust ever got nearly as much as much of a problem. The lack of species in the white pine branch of the pine genus. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah.
That's a very good question. You want to be a graduate student and answer that question?
Betsy, you're up if you want to unmute.
Yeah, John, thank you. It was so interesting to read your book and learn about the succession I lived in Southwest Minneapolis before I moved to Grand Marais. And just outside my door was like a 75-year-old white pine, obviously planted a little close to my home on, my postage stamp house on the corner. But I, just really protected and had a fondness for that pine, and would sit under it and listen to the wind blow through it. And I've just always, I think, felt an affection for white pines, especially. It was so interesting to read through and hear how really the voice of what was going to happen with all of our white pines and lumber and things like that came through the Forest Service. I mean, it doesn't feel like there was a lot of other voices other than governmental, I mean, that really drove the decisions made that affected everything. So like when I walk into the forest here, it's nothing like, what it was 200 years ago, which I think in reading this book kind of blew my mind, that I'll never really, other than being in the Boundary Waters, know what it was like. So yeah, it was very interesting to read just what's happened over time, and that forest ecology is kind of a new science, kind of blows my mind too. So the last thing I'll say, and then let you comment, is I appreciated at the end or near the end of your book the example of the Menominee in northeastern Minnesota who have a sustainable practice going that's also allows them to sell their timber, but at I think a much more sustainable way. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, the Menominee can do this because they never destroyed the forest to begin with. It's awfully hard to take a forest that's been converted because of mistakes we made to aspen, and try to restore it to the original white pine forest that you see in the Boundary Waters. So when you have it, you can make money, quite a bit of money off it. The other example of that is John Ryla. And actually up in Cook County, Howard Hedstrom was doing a magnificent job harvesting white pine, largely off of Forest Service land. But really, the role of these sawmills, like Howard's, was to actually help the Forest Service. If people think of, well, the sawmill has a contract, and the contract allows them to go in and cut the timber and then make it into lumber and sell it. But really, when it works well, there's a closer relationship between the sawmill and the surrounding national forest, where the sawmill owner and the loggers actually implement what the Forest Service foresters want to do to bring the forest into some desired future condition. And so they are actually, when it works well, they're actually working well to implement Forest Service policy. And they aren't just timber barons robbing the forest anymore. And Howard was a really good example of it. John Ryla, the whole Ryla family out at Grand Rapids, they have their own forest. It's about 25,000 acres. It's called the Wolf Lake Tract. And they manage it themselves. And they work with the surrounding Chippewa National Forest, actually in kind of a more research mode, to try and implement some of these new ideas in forestry. But they don't get much of their timber from the surrounding Chippewa National Forest. So these are two different business models of how sawmills work with the Forest Service. And they both work well, but in different ways. And the Menominee, of course, we forced them onto their reservation and said, okay, you live here, we don't want that timber anymore and everything. And look what they've done with it. They've created, first place, they preserved their culture around the white pine and that kind of forest. And they've created jobs and for the people and beautifully managed. And they don't, like Jack Ryler, John Ryler does, they don't just manage for white pine. They manage also for all these species associated with white pine, like sugar maple and so forth. So they all they both take, or all three people take a real ecosystem management approach to things. Howard might disagree with me. He doesn't like the term ecosystem management, but that's what he's doing. Yeah, but the Forest Service, hold on a second. Let me get a book just to hold. Here, these are the two books, and if you recall, there's two chapters on these books. One is by Gifford Pinchot, who was the founder of the Forest Service. And this little book here is called The White Pine. And this is a first edition. It's actually kind of rare. And I was able to get it online. But here's the title page. It's probably backwards. But this was the first book written about management of white pine. And it's there's a little bit about the science, but the book is full of tables like this called volume tables. And the point of this book was that foresters can take it out. You see, it's a very small book. It would fit in their pockets. That the early foresters from the Forest Service could take this out in the woods with them, and it would help them restore and manage white pine and calculate the amount of board feet in a stand of timber of different productivities and stuff. So Pinchot wrote this to restore white pine to its former glory in order to provide a sustainable supply of white pine timber. Before Pinchot did this, nobody was thinking about sustainability. It's like, well, why bother? There's plenty of timber. We just keep going west and we get to the prairie, and we go over the prairie and there's even bigger trees out west. Who cares? Why would you want to sustain this stuff? But Pinchot realized, no, there's an end to this. And so he wrote this book. And this is the first book written about for any tree species in North America. And then there's another chapter about this book, also called The White Pine. And this was written by a forester and a botanist. And this is more of a, it's also has stuff in it about math.
Looks like he froze. We'll be back in just a second.
Pulling together. And this book is the model of the way the Forest Service now has books called the Silvix Manual. They'll take every tree species in North America that has a commercial purpose or commercial value, and even many that do not. And they write a long chapter, and it's put into a 2-volume Silvix Manual, it's called, about that tree. And it combines both the biology of the tree and how to manage the tree. This book is the model that everybody goes back to for how to write those chapters. So these two books set the stage for how to think more scientifically and more sustainability about the management of these tree species in North America. And they are the foundation of forestry in North America and also forest ecology in North America. So how we think about the forest as a collection of trees and individual species that's more than just a warehouse of lumber that's out there, but that interact with each other and with other organisms. So that's the foundation of forestry in America, is white pine.
Other questions from people?
I have a little question about the currants and gooseberries. On my little 3 acres, where I'm planting white pines, is it worth trying to manage the currant and the gooseberry bushes? Or is it, I'm close to the lake, on the hillside going up from the lake toward the ridge.
Yeah. Where did gooseberry, one of my uncles who was in CCC spent a lot of years pulling up gooseberries. He thought it was make work. And research on gooseberries and the blister rust has shown that it's not as bad, lethal as it once was. It was at one time thought to be a death certificate for white pine. But the places where it is a problem apparently is places where there's considerable amount of fog. So if you are in the fog belt above Lake Superior, which is about, a couple hundred feet up from the lake, where there's often a fog layer there, that is particularly conducive for the spread of blister rust. So I would say if you have gooseberries on your property, you need to manage them or get rid of them. But what I would suggest you do is contact your local DNR or county forester and get their advice, because you're talking about something that's very specific to your site, and they would have to look at your site and look at how many gooseberries do you have out there, are you in the fog belt, and so forth. But there are also coming online now some blister rust resistant strains of white pine. So you might be able to find, actually your local county forester could suggest a source of a rust resistant pine, and you might want to try planting those. So without walking around in your land, I can't say for sure, but I think you probably need to exercise a bit of caution there and research.
Heather, would you like to go?
I don't want to hog the questions here, but I had regarding this management, I was a little blown away by the implication of some of the CCC work that you had, that in some sense it was, more beneficial to the workers than it was to the restoring of the pine forest, all things taken together, with the blister rust being included, and a lot of the places missing the fungal foundation to make the forest thrive. So would it be a fair assessment that a lot of that work wasn't actually super helpful for the forest itself in the end?
No, I think it was very helpful. But the CCC had two purposes. And the original purpose was to get young men out of the city during the Depression, because these young men were out of work. And, a lot of young men in their late teens and early 20s out of work it's a recipe for disaster. And Franklin Roosevelt actually loved the outdoors in the woods as much as his cousin Theodore did. And he had this idea that getting out in the woods would just be good for these young men. It would prevent the buildup of crime rings in the cities, and so gangs and so forth. It's something we should consider today. And he was friends with Gifford Pinchot, just like Teddy Roosevelt was. And Pinchot was all for that idea of, get out in the fresh air and do some good and, build something. And so it was as much of a social experiment to start with as it was a forest restoration project. But then they sort of merged together. And Pinchot was the one who convinced Roosevelt that they should expand it, not just for out of work young men in the cities, but also out of work young men in rural towns, small towns in the country, and get people out, get young men out in the woods. And many of these young men came in and they were illiterate. They just, or barely literate. And the CCC taught them how to read and how to write. And every CCC camp had a library. Many of them that I've seen, really nice library with fireplaces and bookcases like this behind me and stuff. And these young men would spend their evenings in the library reading about natural history. And that's what it was stuck with, as well as American history. And they became literate because of the CCC. But they also developed, almost all of them, a real love for nature. And two of my uncles were in the CCCs, and they loved to hunt and fish. That's what they grew up doing. But they also learned about conservation. And the CCC ended right before World War II. And in fact, the CCCs were some of the first men sent over into the army, out into the battlefields, because the CCC was a military structure. And when they came back, the CCC had been dismantled, but they kept that idea of just, and you talk to people like my uncles, this, you mention the CCCs and their eyes light up. You know, I just remember my uncles like, oh, best time of my life, best time of my life. And they came back and they said, well, how do I keep doing this? And many of them were the founders of local chapters of Ducks Unlimited and Trout Unlimited and Pheasant Unlimited and so forth. So they really started the public hunter, fisherman, conservationist kind of ethic, which is related to, but not the same as like the Sierra Club and the more wilderness oriented environmental organizations. But they started the Ducks Unlimited. And mainly what I remember my uncles doing was, you know, spending their weekends when they weren't hunting and fishing, doing stream restoration or, you know, marsh restoration for the ducks and so on, so that they could go and, you know, catch fish and hunt. But they loved the time doing it. So the CCC, it was to me, it was a success in every way, both from a conservation and restoration standpoint, a social standpoint. The one thing that the CCC fell down upon, and it was just a common part of our culture, that they did not have many Black men in the CCC. They actively discriminated against Black people. And that was a failing, but that was a failing society-wide at that time. The CCCs were no different than anybody else. In fact, if they had tried to be a little more active in integrating, I think there would have been an outcry against them. And it doesn't excuse what they did, but in the social environment of that time, it just wasn't possible to do what they were trying to do, as well as integrate the Black and white people of North America together. There were Indians in the Native Americans in the CCCs who were more accepted than Black people in the CCCs. So that was the one part of their social experiment that didn't work.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Some people who haven't had a chance yet to ask a question, we've got about 10 minutes left. Burning questions that other people might have. Now is your time.
Stories about white pines that you have?
White Pine stories, what would you like to share? Voices we haven't heard.
One of the parts I really enjoyed about the book, which isn't surprising since this is a naturalist book club was the chapter on Thoreau and how he actually was like one of the first naturalists and the first to actually by observation and then the other painters drew attention to what happened to the forest. And that was really interesting to me. And I enjoyed that part of it.
Yeah. I've never been a big fan of Walden. I don't think I've ever finished Walden. I've picked it up a number of times and I've tried to read it and I just can't get through it. But his book on the Maine woods is just wonderful. And the books I like the best, well, he's written a number of essays that I cite in that chapter that have been compiled into various other books, natural history essays of Thoreau and books like that, but his journals. And if you could get a hold of many of the volumes of Thoreau's journals, they were edited by English majors. And so they took out all the natural history and just let in the bad poetry and philosophy and all that kind of stuff. But if you could get a hold of the complete journals of Thoreau, the ones I have in the shelf back there were published like in 1905 or something like that. And Princeton University Press is coming out with a new edition. And just read through it. And it's full of these natural history observations and ideas about things that he wanted to investigate and so forth. Those are really fun to read, really fun to read. So if you're a little bit turned off by the preachiness of Walden, like I was, try some of the other writings of Thoreau. He was a remarkable naturalist, absolutely remarkable.
I have a comment, not a question. I was very surprised by the part of your book in which you talked about the shipping industry. That the white pines were harvested as masts for the shipping industry in Europe. I was stunned by the size of the trees that they were cutting down and the number of them. You at one point, I think, mentioned ships were specially built for carrying these masts, and they were huge.
Yeah.
And then you went on to say that one of those ships sank, leaving the British Army without mast for its ships, which hampered their part in the naval part of the Revolutionary War. Could you say more about that?
Yeah, well, it sank, but also the colonists, once we went to war, they blockaded sending white pine to Britain. They didn't want to send white pine to the British Navy.
Mm-hmm.
But they still sold white pine kind of through a black market, privateer kind of thing. John Paul Jones was, brought white pine over to France. So the French ships had American masts. And the British Navy thought when the Revolutionary War started, they actually thought, oh, this piece of cake, this war will be over by Christmas. We'll be home by Christmas. Every stinking war that starts, someone says we'll be home by Christmas, right? Yeah. Well, so they didn't lay in a big supply of white pine masts. And these masts had to be replaced on ships every 3 to 5 years because after a while they crack and they fatigue and wear out. Well, they went through their own supply of the big masts very quickly. And then they started splicing smaller trees together, which worked okay. But in a storm, the mast would break. And then you're left without sails. But the interesting thing is that when Washington had Cornwallis bottled up at Yorktown in Virginia, the British Navy was on its way to rescue Cornwallis and bring the British Army out, what remained of it, and so they could fight another day. But they were coming, they ran into a big storm and their masts all broke and they never made it to rescue Cornwallis. But the French Navy went around that storm with American white pine masts and blockaded Yorktown from the sea. So Cornwallis was surrounded, and that's why he surrendered. And I learned that from a book on the naval history of the United States during the Revolutionary War. And this particular author said that the role of white pine in the American Revolution was really very little appreciated. So I hope that chapter in my book sparks some discussion. But that was the chapter where I think I learned the most, that I didn't realize. And I just kept reading and reading and reading about this. And I thought, wow, how come they didn't teach us this in history books and stuff? But it's in there. It's in books on the naval history of America. And it's really fascinating.
That's the chapter where I learned the most too. All the other chapters, I had a basis already and was able to learn more about each topic, but that one was a complete surprise to me.
Yeah, a lot of people say that's their favorite chapter,
Mm.
which is kind of funny because when I started writing the book, I didn't think, well, okay, yeah, I'll sort of mention the role of white pines in the Revolution, but
Mhm.
it's much more important than I had realized when I first started writing the book.
If there's still time, I've got a question about white pines in the future. And wondering if you have any thoughts or recommendations on compatible shrubbery and plants that might be typical in the future white pine forests along the North Shore and elsewhere. What have you found when you've explored some of the best and oldest stands of? I know it can be a dark understory, but in diverse forest with white pines, what do you find would be compatible?
Are you talking about shrubs itself or other? So for other tree species, I would say northern red oak and sugar maple would be the best ones to plant. For the understory, mountain ash often grows underneath white pine, and then along on the forest floor, things like bunchberry, gold thread, twin flower, Linnea borealis, things like that will often grow. And if the white pine canopy is intact, you walk into a white pine forest or forest dominated by white pine, it's cool in there. It creates its own microclimate. And that's not going to completely reverse the effects of global warming, but it will create a microclimate so that those species will probably hang on. Hopefully long enough, and the white pine stays there, that when we get our act together and we get the climate to start cooling again, they'll still be there and be the nucleus of repopulating the surrounding forest. The idea that the Nature Conservancy chapter in Minnesota has called conifer strongholds. We have to preserve these conifers in cold spots, and they will be the nuclei for restoring the forest surrounding them.
Well, we are at about 7:30 exactly. Could we take one last question of anyone who hasn't spoken yet? And if there is none, then we'll thank you profusely. But is there one last question from someone who's just been quietly waiting to lunge at the last opportunity? Branch out, I should say, at the last opportunity.
Oh, that's a good one. Branch out. I like that.
Well, I didn't want to needle anybody, but I'm done now. Any last questions? Well, going once, twice. Okay.
Well, let me thank you for this. Really has been wonderful. You've had great questions. Thank you for buying the book. Authors like it when you buy books, particularly if you bought it from a local bookseller. And it's been great. You probably get the idea that I could talk about this stuff all night. So I could stay here forever talking about this stuff. I love it. And I hope you do too. We live in a beautiful, beautiful part of the world. I've worked in Scandinavia, in China. I've been through much of the world, up in the Arctic, the Antarctic. This still is the place where I come back to. This is, to me, the most beautiful part of the world that I've ever lived in or worked in. Northern Scandinavia is a good second, but this is home. So I hope you like it. I hope you now know that white pine has an important role in making it our home. And we should do everything we can to try and keep it here and healthy.
We're so grateful for your time, John, and for everybody that took time tonight to come together and ask questions and just be together as we talk about books. Just a reminder about the one we have coming up next, which is going to be the Naturalist book group focused on trails and exploration. That's to be on January 9th. And if you maybe have a book that you'd want to host in the future, let me know. Always happy to chat with you about ideas for things we could do together. Thank you so much, everyone. Stay cozy. It's chilly out there.